let's hear from group number one. I think, how many groups do we have, Paul? 8 groups?
7 groups.
Okay, let's go from the reverse. Group number 7, where'd you guys go with your conversation?
In our group, we talked about, well, something that resonated with me is what motivates institutions to engage in equity work. And we talked a lot about understanding the individual values of whoever you're interacting with at an organization, whether it is your coworker or somebody in HR or whatnot, and understanding what they care about and talking about how equity work can help realize some of their values and hopes. And just the importance of, I think, like persistence and heart messages kind of for some folks. And then there's a wide variety of experiences that people had in terms of their individual comfort across those different groups and where they were at and where their organization was at, and sort of reinforcing what James had said earlier about when you really look and disaggregate it and think community by community, that we're kind of all over the place. And it's a real nice invitation to have some humility and curiosity about where we're at and what we can do to have a more inclusive and educated approach. And that's my report out.
Okay. And that was group number 7. And thank you, Stacy. You know, something that I think a lot of us struggle with is the comfort level of approaching this, right? And I guess I've done it enough and made enough mistakes that I'm no longer embarrassed by my faux pas. I kind of anticipate them. I kind of look at them as stumbling blocks and areas from which I might grow. But this idea of becoming comfortable with discomfort. For example, I talked about the high anxiety I had this morning. It began right after I finished my workshop last night for the Vulnerable Dental Society. And I thought I could relax, and I got in bed and hoping to sleep. And of course, I was worried about today. And so what I've learned to do is get comfortable with my performance anxiety, right? What I also know is when I don't have the anxiety, when I don't have the discomfort, I'm going to suck real bad, right? And the interesting thing is that it goes away as soon as I step to the podium, as soon as the mic turns on, as soon as one steps on the court. So what I'm going to suggest is you will have anxiety working cross-culturally. It tends to go away. You tend to walk away with a little bit of knowledge, but the discomfort is healthy. I think not to be uncomfortable would be kind of worrisome. Anything anyone else want to share from group number 7 that Stacy may have missed? Okay. Thank you, Stacy. Appreciate that. Group number 6.
Yeah, this is Celeste Baca. I was kind of doing the facilitator and the note taking. And we touched on a few things. We didn't get through all the questions, but some things that were brought up is just how sometimes our personal experiences, like for example, a couple of group members had family members with disabilities, and sometimes that experience, that countertransference can occur when working with clients, and sometimes our personal experiences can hinder our work with clients because their experience isn't our experience. And then we talked about access to interpreters, to help mitigate trauma for, children that have been put in positions where they have to interpret for their families, and also to help prevent misdiagnosing people. Then we talked about some of our strengths and areas where we identified some implicit bias. And I think there was some group members where they had more strengths working with the LGBTQ community, but more implicit bias, either working with people struggling with poverty, and sometimes that bias where they don't necessarily understand the systemic issues and sometimes that bias of sometimes that mindset of pick yourself up by your bootstraps and the lack of understanding there with the socioeconomic issues. And then myself, just coming from an Hispanic, Latino, and Native American background, that implicit bias working with Euro-American groups, just because of the historical experiences with racism and things of that sort. So we kind of shared some of our personal experiences, but I think that's as far as we got.
No, I think that's really cool. And anybody want to add from Group 6 anything that Celeste may have missed? I think a couple of things were rather important. One was, and I never thought of this before, Celeste, but the idea of having a family member with a disability or who is, and how that's a learning opportunity. One of my real challenges working cross-culturally was when I did children with special healthcare needs. And I hadn't any background at all. And it was a real steep learning curve. And I was amazed at siblings who had a brother or sister that they cared for, and they were so far advanced in terms of their ability to care and understand beyond myself. I never thought of them, the flip side of that, in that they might impose their perspectives on someone else. So I really appreciate you for that. The other thing that you mentioned that I think is really critical is the healthcare interpreter concept. And those of you who are working with patients, I would urge you to learn how to work with healthcare interpreters, right? And a real simple notion is, as I mentioned, how important the relationship is. One of the practices that were being proposed by the National Healthcare Interpreter Association years ago was that you place the interpreter behind you so that it forces you to look at the patient and not the interpreter, right? Because you don't need the relationship with the interpreter. We kind of want it with the patient. And so it's nuances like that. So while we are learning about the importance of healthcare interpretation, those of you working might want to perhaps visit the Oregon Healthcare Interpreter Association. I believe we have a portal where we offer advice like that. And that's going to be a bigger concern in the future because language access is going to be an accreditation point. And the other thing that I think Celeste alluded to was her own identity and how that works for her at times and against her at times in terms of her understanding. And again, I want to thank Celeste for being vulnerable and sharing. Anything that anybody from her group would add before we move to Group 5?
Well, I think one group member mentioned, as far as sexual minorities, that many of us have a lot to learn there. There's just a lot of ins and outs that we don't know yet. And it's okay to, let clients and other people know, like, I just don't know. Can you teach me? Like you said, kind of letting them have that teaching moment with us. So that was one thing I forgot.
No, and that's also important. We would understand rather quickly from a research perspective. In the old days, if you were to mount a research effort on LGBTQ, they did have to be part of the research team. And so the research team typically didn't have that input. If you were researching women, women weren't necessarily part of the research team. Poor, not part of the research team. People with disabilities, not part of the research team. And so as a result, what we've tended to learn is what's called the deficit perspective. We know what's wrong with women, people of color, people with disabilities, seniors, veterans. We tend not to know their resiliencies. And in fact, what we think we know what's wrong with them is often based on biased research methodology. So the old forms of studying women wouldn't pass muster these days. The old forms of studying poverty or race or sexuality wouldn't pass muster these days. The sad thing is what we have in our body of knowledge is a bunch of stuff that's rooted in deficit research, deficit-based research, and which has given rise to these emerging models of strengths-based research and participatory research and advocacy-based research. So we're in a great, great, great place, a better place. A long way to go, all of us, and I appreciate the humility that's been expressed so far. Group number 5, where'd you guys go with your discussion?
Hi, I'm representing group number 5. So we did kind of a share out rather than a discussion sort of model, and everyone talked about their results on the tool and sort of where they landed. People were really vulnerable in sharing those things with a new group of people. And that kind of led into how a lot of us tend to have a higher number with a group that we have either been a part of at one time or identify currently as part of that group. Also, work was talked about a lot. If folks had worked with certain populations and had time being close with those populations, it tended to raise the number also. We also went into the COVID phenomenon and how some of us have felt more isolated, or our work has primarily been over the phone or the computer, and how that has sort of changed where we might have landed on the tool, and how the tool and our numbers can change over time too, depending on what we're currently doing in our lives and what's happening. Some people talked about how this tool was a friendly tool in the sense that if you were a 1 or 2 for all these groups, you could still feel really good about yourself, because a 1 on the tool is still being able to greet and positively engage people. So it was kind of a strengths-based tool rather than that someone was negative or that we liked that, and it felt sort of created a safer environment, I think, for our group. There was talk about, using, we had folks who were in behavioral health and folks who were in education. So we talked about specific environments and how this work is really important and trying to promote it within your environment. And using our own privilege was talked about, and how like each one of us has different privileges and how we can bring that, instead of being ashamed of that, but bringing it into this work, being vulnerable around it, using it proactively and positively. I'm trying to catch everything here. The last part, I think, and this spoke to me personally as a behavioral health person, one of our group members talked about sort of the trauma-informed care model, and how trauma and how we all have our own trauma component, and the groups that we are engaging with and interacting with have that component, and how at some point taking a look at how that sort of cross-sectionally intersects with different groups and experiences would be really fascinating. And just the final piece I want to mention for someone is it was talked about, some of our folks weren't on camera, but just how based on so kind of the group we're sharing with in these EDI trainings and exercises, how with different groups, sometimes we consciously and subconsciously show up differently, and how certain times it feels safer and less safe, and just kind of noticing that, just noticing it, not really much more discussion past that. And I think that's it. I hope I got everyone's stuff in there, and that's it.
I thought you killed it. You talked about work and the populations you serve. Here's an interesting thing. A real innocent and low-cost intervention from a service delivery standpoint is periodically doing focus groups with the people we serve, right? And basically, it's a cost of pizza, maybe childcare, and typically we think of focus groups as an opportunity to get information, and we will. But if we do focus groups, the way that I've typically done them is to disseminate information as well, and kind of impressing upon them why we're trying to learn and why we've assembled them and stuff like that. The interesting thing is that if we ask them what respectful care looks like, it's kind of harder to conjure up respectful care in a vacuum. What's easier for them is to talk about what disrespectful care looks like and use that as a starting point. And we shouldn't feel indicted if we start there. The other thing that you said was the COVID era and how crazy this is. And the isolation from each other is one thing, which I think is supremely daunting, at least for me. But not being able to see my client, sense their nonverbals, get a whiff of their pheromones, if there's such a thing, and not know how to help them in a full way is kind of perplexing to me. Even as a presenter, what I don't get is I don't get to look at the audience and see a wrinkled brow to know that someone didn't get it. I don't see a frown to know that I offended someone. I don't see someone not smile to know that my joke didn't go over well, right? And it's all about me, just so you know. Um, uh, um, but my point is that we're living in very funny times. Acknowledge that. This is crazy and crazy making. The other thing is the tool, and I appreciate you saying this, Sarah, because I didn't. Looking at this tool involves an iterative process. We don't look at it and say, I'm a 1 and I'm done. We look at it and say, I'm a 1 and I want to build on that. And we say that I found myself, I had a couple of 2s and 3s, which suggests that I can build on that. It's an iterative process. It was meant to be a safe tool. It was meant to also explore your strengths as well as areas we need to grow. Here's where it gets really crazy. It's not a linear process. So if you ever give yourself a 4 or a 5, what you're going to find yourself time 2, time 3 is backing up. So at one point I thought I was a 5 with African Americans because I'm kind of black, right? Well, I am black. I'm fully black. I am, trust me. And as I went around the country and I'd work with other black groups, I would be like, damn, there is so much I do not know, right? And so starting from a 5, I became a 4 and I became a 3, and I vacillate between 3 and 4 because the more you learn about a topic, the more you know you don't know. So that's a natural thing. Here's something else I thought was rather profound, is using your privilege to leverage privilege for others. I'm kind of hetero. Well, I am hetero. I'm college educated. I'm native born, and I have unearned privileges as a result of that. I'm male. I try to get people who are not in those categories a dose of my privilege because I like the privileges that I have. I don't want to give them up. I have no shame. I have no guilt. I'll get them for you, right? Which makes me feel just a little bit better. The idea of trauma-informed care and how, as cool as we are, how we might be carrying unheeded, unwitting trauma with us and carrying it with us into our helping profession sometimes. So the idea of introspection becomes rather critical and self-assessment. And lastly, you brought the issue of safety. And I think to have these questions, we have to make sure that we show grace, create a safe environment in which to learn. And people are going to say goofy things. We might have to help them understand their impact, but also discern that their intent was honorable, even though I have an assistant that I work with who happens to be female, and in our presentation last night, the moderator called her gal a couple of times, right? And I'm like, ooh wee, ouch, ouch. And it's just interesting. The intent wasn't negative, but my colleague isn't a gal, kind of, right? So it's just interesting. Thank you, Sarah. I thought that was tremendous. Group number 4.
Okay. I was in group 4, and we spent a little bit of time in the beginning just introducing ourselves and where we were from. And I think we discovered there was some delight in discovering what a diverse group we were, in terms of just where folks are from and different professional backgrounds as well. We had folks not just from Oregon in this organization, but joining, from Sweden, the Gulf Coast, New Mexico. So that was fun to hear about, in a variety of professions. We looked at question 1, what were the strengths and areas of growth, and some really cool shares. It was interesting. Several people shared their experiences working with homeless population and looking at their strength and their growth there. One participant shared that years ago, when he started in his current job, he had started working with the homeless population and knew he needed to make some shifts, and had to dive into his own countertransference because he recognized he was building walls with people and had to pay attention to his own internal process. And starting to move forward beyond that, he found his growth edge, because he was willing to do his own self-reflection. And also, I would invite these people whose stories I'm sharing to please feel free to jump in, or add to this. I want to honor that I'm sharing someone else's story, and I want to get that right. Another participant had shared also, who is a nurse, RN, who had worked in hospitals for a number of years. And the experience of a lot of times those settings or those systems can be very judgmental. And she found that she was sort of, in her new work, was glad to get out of that hospital setting, and has been learning so much going into patient homes and learning their stories and doing house calls. She's currently working with homeless and obese populations, and she honors that her patients are vulnerable when she goes into their home, and that she wants to honor that that is their space and their home and learn from them. And Carrie, our facilitator, reflected that gives us, how important it is to always be curious when working with others. Another participant shared, in terms of the tool, of finding, when she has done clinical behavioral health work in jails, that it's been difficult working with some of the homeless folks, and struggling sometimes when she encounters people who have not used the resources that were available. And she was able to use that to see her bias and growth in terms of the tool. And I wanted to wrap with Tommy gave a really nice quote that I grabbed from the chat. She said, "Self-reflection provides the opportunity to see personal biases that you carry, our implicit bias. Self-reflection helps you to acknowledge and to face this."
Wow.
So that was our wrap up.
Oh, goodness gracious, you guys packed a lot into that, and I appreciate Tommy for that reflection, and I think it's absolutely true. Thank you, Kelly. That was great. The interesting thing is hearing is your group, you guys probably all had insights around some of the diverse populations you served, and can you imagine having more time to have processed that, what we could have learned? The other thing is talking about the tool. One of the ways that I design the tool and use the tool also is I take out the categories on the left, the populations, and allow people to self-populate and then wonder where they are, right? So for example, you can take out everything and just put the BIPOC groups or the LGBTQs or the what have yous in there just to wonder. And so using your imagination, what we want to do when we do this tool is we don't want to beat ourselves up. We want to start with our strengths. When my youngest son was little, he was a little rambunctious in daycare. And I think part of it was because he was reading at 3, and so when he would go to school, he was really restless during the reading stuff, when they would read to him. And so he often spent a whole lot of time in wasn't a principal, the owner of the business office. And typically when I would go there to pick him up, his teacher would say, "Do you know what your son did today?" And I'm like, oh, goodness, right? And so I remember telling him after about the 10th time ever doing that, "Do you know what?" I said, "Was he dressed well? Was his breath fresh? Was his hair combed? Is there anything good about him that you can start with before you sock me in the stomach?" When we look at these assessments, let's start with what's good. Let's build on that. Let's don't go to where we're weak and then extol that. Let's extol our virtues and understand that based on that we can have additional virtues. The other thing that you said was, I appreciate the idea of someone being too. So, for example, when I moved here to Oregon, I grew up in South Central LA, the hood. Then I moved to Santa Monica, the non-hood, right? As a high schooler. Surrounded by Malibu, Beverly Hills, Brentwood, Bel Air, blah, 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 right? And when I got here and when I started encountering other Black people, they said, "You talk white," right? And I'm like, I'll be damned. And then when I would in white circles, I talked to ethnic. And what I found was when you have a critical mass of people, what's acceptable is expanded. So in South Central LA in an all-black enclave, I don't talk white, right? Um, then the idea of faith that you bring up, Kelly, I think is also profound because faith doesn't always meet science very well. Um, Faith is belief. We are tend to be more evidence, and so they aren't necessarily speaking on the same lane. And if you have a faith bias, you might want to discern that as quickly as possible, and to some extent treat that. Um, and the last thing you uh, talked about, what at least I took notes on, was the house call experience. And what I would say about those of us who are doing house calls, hospice, palliative care, you really get to know the patient, the patient's family, the patient's context, and going there in a learning mode is absolutely critical. But finding ways to share your learnings with other people that have to go in those environments and be respectful um, is powerful. Don't underestimate what you're learning when you have to go be someone who isn't always at their best. And even though, and I really love the idea of it's their domain, respect it. Let's don't impose. Great job. Appreciate that, Kelly, in a big way. Group number 3, I'm trying to get us back on time to some extent. Group number 3, where'd you guys go with your conversation?
James, are you giving the report out?
Sure. I took notes, and I had a very fun group. I was surprised that I got beamed into that environment, but I had a joy, and I really want to appreciate the group for again feeling vulnerable. One of the things that we shared was just sometimes our discomfort going into certain cultures, not knowing. Um, I remember teaching at graduate school of social work for years, and how a lot of my colleagues wouldn't want to teach the diversity courses because they thought they were going to be put on the spot. And I had to remind them that we're not there as content matter experts and know-alls. We're there to facilitate knowledge. And a big part of that is understanding what we don't know. As I said earlier, feel bad if you don't know your ABCs. Feel bad if you don't know your primary colors. We weren't exposed to diversity in a good way. We're all learning. So wherever you are is where you are today. Be better tomorrow. Um, so I thought that was important to understand that we are sometimes uncomfortable. I was also impressed with someone who talked about the various intersections they had in their own identities. They talked about themselves in terms of a racial identity, a gender identity, a sexual orientation, a class identity, an educational identity, and how these things take different precedence at different times. I thought that was rather fine. Someone else talked about an experience with a patient, and even though they found a way to communicate with them in a language, wasn't thinking that they were comprehending as fully as they would have liked. And it made me think of the teach back or talk back method. It also made me think of the ask me 3 method. The teach back or talk back method is if I were imposing information to someone, I might, when I was done, ask them to repeat what they think I said. And here's a real nuance, to make sure I said it correctly. Not that they heard it correctly, but that I said it correctly, which takes the onus off of them. And we find Teach Back to be rather profound around a health literacy tool. The Ask Me 3 is we often want to ask our patients to ask me 3 questions just to ensure they comprehend it. The interesting thing with that is often they're intimidated to ask the questions, at which point I would urge you, if you're doing the Ask Me 3 technique, is to identify 3 questions you think they should ask to kind of prime the pump. The other thing that someone mentioned was their experience being in a privileged group and feeling that they hadn't experienced a whole lot of bias in their life. And an interesting thing that I thought with respect to that is bias can be interpersonal. It can also be systemic. And the systemic might be hard to so for example, if we were to look at SATs or GREs, they tend, historically, they were under normed on women, people of color, rural populations, ELLs, ESLs, and so they often scored poorly on such a standardized test. And then the idea of someone had a family member and friends that they learned, help learn with, because it was a safe environment to talk about. But learning about SOGI, learning about privilege, and how the environments in which we learn don't always have to be academic if we take advantage of it. Anything I missed, Kathy, Janet, anyone else in my group? Anything I under expressed?
No, you did great. Thank you. From my perspective.
The check is in the mail, Kathy.
You did well.
Yes, thank you.
Group number 2.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jennifer. I'll just say that we didn't have time to designate someone before, so other folks in the group, please feel free to hop in. But yeah, many of the things that have come out of other groups' discussions we had as well. I think we really spent a lot of time looking at the tool and reflecting on what it meant to us personally and how we were thinking about how we would use it as a self-reflection tool. And then we had a lot of conversation about possible ways that we could see it being really helpful in our work collaborations, and also from the idea that these questions that's maybe we start with as a self-reflection, this tool could also be a way to have a conversation with other people we're working with that maybe are in one of these groups of difference, and a way to ask that person or that group, how is it that I might be able to move through these different stages and act in a way that would better serve to help or accept or advocate. And so we just explored that. And yeah, and then people shared some about their own backgrounds, and the discussion led around how do we think about our identities within these groups, and how we may even continue to have implicit bias even as an identifying person within a group, and then how that impacts even our starting place of interacting with other groups. So that's what I will share, and I'll invite anyone else on my group to hop in as well.
Well,
I can. Hi, James. It's Jim. I'm happy to share a little bit.
oh,
I was
thank
in
you,
that.
Jim. I appreciate that.
I thought it was so interesting. There were some who could clearly say that they were helping today in their daily work, but sometimes their daily work was so speedy that they realized that they might need to slow down and reflect a little more and try to find space to do some more reflection. And so this tool helped them to contemplate that. We had another individual who reflected that she personally and with her family was actually in many of those boxes, but also caused her to reflect where she might be in her experiences and what that might mean to help others, and found this a very interesting reflective tool. I felt like the group was in a very awe-inspired, contemplative mode with this tool, and loved the tool, and actually almost wanted to do more reflection, to be honest. And so the conversation was slow but very thoughtful, and everybody thought that this tool was great.
Thank you, Jim. Anybody else want to add? My disappointment around today is not having more time with my group. I think I was in group number 3. I was having a great time having a discussion and slowing the world down and thinking. Typically, when I bring groups back together, the first question I ask is not about the product, not what was discussed, but how you felt discussing it. how comfortable or how likely you are able to have a good conversation around diversity, making yourself vulnerable with prospective strangers, and how important it is to create a safe environment for that, and how important it is to know that we all struggle with this. Often we want to beat ourselves up for not knowing, and how reassuring it is because someone else didn't know. I remember being a student, and some of you may have had this experience, but you have this question you want to ask, but you think if you ask the question, it will reveal that you didn't do all the reading, right? Particularly in graduate school, and I'm like, am I going to ask this? Am I going to ask this? And someone over in the corner asked the question, and the instructor saying, that is a great question. Um, Learning that someone else struggled with this as I did was really empowering, believe it or not. Something else I would share is the idea that you guys talked about the different backgrounds and the different identities we all hold. We're a multitude of identities if we consider ourselves as a team. Something else that was brought up was our internal biases, the extent to which I, as an African American, might have a bias toward other African Americans, or I, as a woman, might have other biases. And here's the funny thing: as an African American, I learned African American culture through the mainstream culture. As if I were female, I would have learned about females through a male dominant culture. So we all have baggage on our intellectual hard drives that pops up at times that we're not always certain. Jim brought up something that I thought was really important. We in healthcare work in a doing culture. We come to work to do. I was raised in a family, my dad was a doer. Um, he would get home from work and the first thing he would ask you was, what are you doing? And if you said nothing, he would say, how do you do nothing? And you would say, I don't know. And then he would say, what do you mean you don't know? Which meant you couldn't say, I don't know again, so your head would explode. So I learned when my dad pulled up, I grabbed a broom, a book, a dust rag, a dustpan. And when I said, when I grew up, I'm just going to buy a big old TV and I'm never going to do anything. I'm not going to be like my dad. Of course, I grew up and I'm just like my dad, and I do as well. It's going to be important that we find times to be. And in fact, being promotes doing. So I really want to thank Jim for holding that out. The other thing that Jim alluded to was that we all belong to many boxes, or we have affiliations with many boxes. So understand that your network might be your strength if we use it correctly. And anything else from group number 2 that neither of the speakers presented that we want to hear? Going. Group number 1, where are you? What'd you guys do?
Good morning. My name is Lupe and I was with group 1. So we started off with, we went over the tool and, we shared out. We all have our strengths and weaknesses and places to improve and grow. Some of us on the group had seen the tool before. For some of us, it was completely new. And so Dr. Luther was in our group and he had to jump off. And right before he left, he asked, he's like, has anybody give yourself a 5? And it kind of got us thinking. So I appreciate earlier in the discussion, Dr. James, you mentioned that it's definitely okay if maybe at this point you're at a 5 and you slide back. Like it's an ebb and flow. Sometimes you'll get work up and you might slide back. So thank you for sharing that. And then one of the things that's stuck with me in our conversation was ideally our own morals will align with the organization or the company that we work with to make it a lot easier to work in the same direction and have the same goal in mind. And then the latter portion of the discussion, definitely depending on the audience that you're speaking to, you're going to change the delivery of the message. So having a good, strong, or at least a basic foundation of the EDI and cultural, linguistically appropriate will help you structure the message of who your audience is and who you are talking to, because they all have different importances or things that is important to them versus a patient or versus the hiring manager. So just knowing that the same point is getting across, it's just the delivery of it is going to be a little bit different.
Love that, Lupe. Anybody else want to add to Lupe's report?
Hi, this is Nora. I think she did a beautiful job summarizing what our discussion was.
Would you add anything, Nora?
I don't think so, other than just the fact that this is, for me, stopping in the midst of all of the crazy. I know that everybody on this call has got to be, oh, I'm sorry, I'll put my screen on. Everybody's in the middle of crazy all the time. You know, we all had more than enough on our plates before COVID. And 2 years in, I can only expect that we're all really tired.
No, bat as crazy. I was going to say bat as crazy, right? Is the norm. We got to own that, right? And to minimize that might put us at risk just a little bit.
So knowing that all that's true, being able to take this morning and step back, excuse me, and have a little time for shared reflection. I think this morning has been a blessing for me already, just to be able to stop and reframe a little bit and think about where, even in the midst of COVID, we're still learning and growing and becoming better. So I'm grateful for this framework, and I'm grateful for the conversation. I think I'm going to leave today a little more rooted and a little more optimistic, and I appreciate that.
Wow, love that, Nora. Thank you. Any last takers from group one? If I may weigh in, the idea of showing yourself grace and showing others grace with this is important. Now, I'm not saying we excuse bad behavior. That's not what I'm saying. But recognize people's struggle and people's pursuit of greater knowledge and competency. And like Lupe said, it isn't linear. And starting at a 5 is not a bad thing. You'll find that humility will kick in and you will back off the 5. Maybe to 3, you'll jump to a 4, and then you'll witness something or experience something that kicks you back to a 3 in pursuit of the 5. The goal is to move toward the 5 with as many populations as you can. The sad thing is you won't get there. Culture is dynamic, context is dynamic, and situations change. So if I became a 5 with women in the 90s or the early 2000s, I may be current, I may not be. If I became a 5 with Soji in the 90s, I may be not aware of the current issues. Or with BIPOC in the 90s, I might not be the sharpest knife in the drawer. Understand it's non-linear. It's a jagged journey. You're going to grow at different rates with different populations. That's okay. I think what I found to be a real powerful tool for me is to make sure that my network was diverse. So that when I had a spooky thing go on or a crazy thing go on, I had someone with whom I could debrief who wasn't necessarily my patient or my customer. The other thing that was brought up was the idea of organizational alignment. And I thought that was really cool. I love where I am right now. And so the interesting thing is at times we have to push and pull our organization to be where we need them to be. Other times we need to learn from our organization. Being an internal advocate is difficult. Do that with grace and respect others. Something else that was said by Lupe that I thought was rather profound is the idea, and I'm calling it context equity, that our messages shouldn't always be the same. And Lupe talked to how you might tailor a message for a hiring manager versus tailoring a message for a patient. In one of the facilities in which I work, not a Care Oregon facility, and I won't even say it's an Oregon facility, but it was an upscale community that was starting to diversify. And you were getting people coming into the waiting room who were historically underrepresented. Uh, Immigrants and refugees, poor people, people with disabilities, LGBTQ. And to some extent, we had to educate our traditional market to accept these new people. And so that was a very interesting message we had to craft. Similarly, when we started collecting racial and ethnic data, we also had to tailor messages for some people. If you were to ask me my race or ethnicity upon intake, I'd tell you. But there are other people who are a little bit more suspicious and guarded and wonder why you're asking. And there are others who think that you're asking as a capitulation to these progressives or these radical liberals or what have you. So again, we have to make sure that our messages can be tailored, and we want to have that facility. And then I really appreciate Nora slowing the world down and getting an opportunity to reflect. And I'm hoping that all of us do and take the opportunity to be, because as soon as we get done with this, we got to go do. Being is important. Slow the world down. And I'll close with this. My mom was a nurse in a women's hospital in LA, and she'd have patients that you know for years. Every now and then I would get home and my mom's car would be in the driveway. All the lights would be out in the house, be 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and I wondered what's up. And I walk around the house looking for my mom, and my mom would be in bed, 6 o'clock, covers up to her face. And what I knew was she lost someone that day. And the bad thing about the work we do, if I really need to connect with someone, if I really need someone to comply, I might need to lower that boundary to have that relationship. When we do that, we run the risk of being hurt. Our work sometimes is painful. The outcomes aren't always rosy. And that can happen from a clinical perspective or an administrative perspective. So what I'm going to suggest to you is make sure that you're taking care of yourselves. Make sure that you take care of each other. The selfless attitude, the stoic attitude that I was raised with doesn't work in the work that we do. We can burn out and we can be good to no one, including ourselves. I'm going to stop there before we take our break. I went over time and I apologize. Any questions that anyone saw in the chat or any questions anyone want to offer before I let you guys take a moment? Hearing none. Go ahead, Paul.
I think we'll use that as the silence of segue in that case then. So thank you, James, and thank you, everyone. I think this has been remarkable this morning where we're at so far. Let's go ahead then and adhere to the agenda as best we're able to. We've got ourselves slotted for a 15-minute break. If folks want to come back a little early, that's perfectly fine. And as soon as we have everyone back together, we'll go ahead and continue with the program this morning. Thank you all so much. We'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you, friends.